Okay, I think we're ready. So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your participation and continued support of SID-W events. My name is Paul Sherman, and I'm the Director of Programs for SID-W. So first and foremost, I want to thank all of the speakers for participating in today's panel. We really appreciate your taking the time out of your schedules to speak with the SID-W community, but also, of course, just hearing your commentary on this important subject. We really do appreciate it. I also want to thank our wonderful co-chairs, Mike Ingram, who is the moderator for today's panel, and Shamaruk Muhyiddin, who is on the call. So we appreciate your continued work through the pandemic. We really appreciate it, and also your work on the previous event too. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with who we are, but for those who aren't, SID Washington is a neutral convener in the international development space to provide opportunities for networking and information sharing. So really these types of events are our bread and butter. We do a whole lot of these throughout the course of the year. We've been averaging about one per week this year, so and that usually is the case. So check out our website. That's where all the updated information will be about our upcoming events. The one I do want to point out is our annual conference, our biggest event of the year. We are doing our second virtual conference. We did our first one last year in October, which was great. So I heartily encourage those of you who are on the call to join. It should be a really, really great event, as was the previous one. All information's online. So feel free to check out our website. That's where you'll find everything about the conference, as well as all of our other events. And that's enough of me talking. I will hand it over to Mike Ingram, who will get us started today.
Thanks so much, Paul. And welcome everybody to this event focused on sustaining private sector partnerships, a discussion around a recent study focused on looking back at the extent to which public-private partnerships that USAID played a role in sustained or endured. This is being hosted by the Corporate Role in Development Working Group. And before I introduce the panel, I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Shamaruk. Shamaruk?
Michael, really excited to convene this panel for the working group today. Mike and I work hard to create a platform to share expertise around public-private partnerships, so I hope you'll continue to engage with us. I'm a principal associate at Nathan, which is a global development consulting firm. We work on a number of economic empowerment issues, including private sector development, trade, market solutions, gender issues, etc. And excited to create a platform where both the corporate sector as well as NGOs can come together to discuss how they can work with each other better. So with that quick introduction, I'll turn it back over to Mike to moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Shamaruk, and appreciate all your help with the working group. Before we get started, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves before we start with a brief presentation. So Todd, maybe if you could kick it off.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. My name is Todd Mullenkamp, and I work in the U.S. Agency for International Development's Private Sector Engagement Hub in the recently operationalized Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation. I'm currently acting as the manager for the director for the Evidence, Learning, and Data team within the hub, and we focus on building the evidence base for engaging the private sector, including creatively identifying tools and systems to collect and use data related to private sector engagement, to nurture information and knowledge sharing across the agency when it comes to PSE, and to examine how to most effectively engage private sector actors with different models in different contexts. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Todd. Joy?
Hello, I'm Joy Marini. I'm with Johnson & Johnson in the Health of Women team in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. We say health of women rather than women's health because, as you can imagine, when you say women's health, people assume this is reproductive health, and this is really the lifespan of the health of women. And I have partnered with USAID in various capacities for more than a decade, so I have a lot to say today. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joy. Leslie?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Leslie Perez. I work for Catholic Relief Services, CRS, in Guatemala. I work implementing a project, Usaid project, that has a leverage commitment of at least $20 million with the private sector. And currently we are working with 12 partnerships with 6 large companies and 6 MSMEs in Guatemala. So happy to be here and to share what we've been doing in the recent years. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Leslie. David?
Good afternoon all. So today I'm representing USAID mission in country of Georgia. I'm senior private sector development advisor and working there for almost 15 years. And together with my kind of small team, I'm managing multiple private sector activities ranging from agriculture, ICT, for like packaging and so on. So we have multiple big, small, interesting cases around PSC, also some challenges in the direction. And I would be happy to share my opinions, like facts about our successes as well as challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We've tried to create a balanced panel, so we have kind of both, USAID from the Private Sector Engagement Hub and in the mission, the private sector and implementing partners that participate in these. So hopefully both the presentation and the discussion afterwards will be interesting and engaging for all. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Todd to give a brief presentation on the study, and then we'll get to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Mike. And just to make sure, you folks can see my screen, correct? Perfect.
Yes.
All right, well, good afternoon, good evening for folks around the world. Thank you for joining this webinar on private sector partnerships. As you may recall from my introduction, my name is Todd Mullenkamp, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a study that was finalized late last year that examines sustainability and scale in partnerships. Although we don't have time to go through everything today, I certainly encourage you to read the external summary that is available on usaid.gov. So during today's event, we'll start off with a brief overview of the Enduring Results study, including some of the basics on research methodology, the framework, and some select findings. The event has also brought together a wonderful collection of panelists who introduced themselves a few minutes ago, who will share some of their own experiences with you all in panel discussion following my brief presentation. So I will try not to make my presentation too tedious or long, to really focus in on that really valuable conversation that we can have afterwards. So I do want to make sure we have time for that discussion. So without further ado, let's dive in. So I'll start off with an introduction. Most of you who are joining this call are well versed in what private sector engagement might mean. But I think it is a topic that still requires a little bit of definition at the beginning. When we talk about private sector engagement at USAID, we're referring specifically to a broad strategic approach to planning and programming through which USAID consults, strategizes, aligns, and collaborates with the private sector. Why do this? Simply put, private enterprise is the single most powerful force for lifting lives, strengthening communities, and accelerating sustainable development. In developing countries, 9 out of 10 jobs are provided by the private sector, and private business brings products to market to improve living conditions for poor people and many vulnerable groups. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I work within USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub. Our mission within USAID is to create the institutional conditions, operating infrastructure, and capacity necessary to expand engagement with the private sector in the United States and partner countries. We are really driven by the belief that pursuing market-based approaches and investment is key to enabling development and empowering people and communities worldwide. So let's dig into the study that we were talking about a little bit today. As USAID emphasizes collaboration, co-design, and co-financing with the private sector, one of our guiding principles is to understand what works and what doesn't. With this objective in mind, USAID has invested in a series of what we call the Enduring Results Study to collect and disseminate evidence on the drivers of sustainability and scale in USAID's partnerships with the private sector. Enduring Results 3.0 is, and you might have guessed, the third iteration of the study examining factors that contribute to the continuity of activities and outcomes and role that the private sector partners play in enabling enduring results. And I'll define enduring results in just a moment. In this study, we explored partnership activities and outcomes from private sector partnerships 2 to 3 years after USAID's formal funding ended. So in this case, that means partnerships where original USAID funding ended in calendar year 2017. In sum, we ended up examining 29 partnerships within these parameters, with the ultimate hopes to understand partnerships' current status and whether they have produced enduring results over time, to identify and examine characteristics more often found in partnerships that produce enduring results or not, and gather multi-stakeholder perspectives and lessons learned to inform recommendations or considerations for future private sector partnerships. Now, as I promised, we call this study series the Enduring Results Study, so I wanted to take a minute to define what we mean by enduring results. In our study, we define enduring results as the long-term continuity of outcomes that stems from the original operational period of a partnership due to ongoing activities by a number of different stakeholders. So for instance, by activities under the private sector, by continuing to serve as a beneficiary population targeted by the partnership, for example, selling products or services, as beneficiaries by maintaining activities launched in the partnership period, for example, by continuing to use improved skills or practices learned during the partnership, or buying and consuming products or services offered by the private sector, by the government, by producing or providing maintenance or funding for infrastructure or services, or enabling policy level changes, or other partners, any ongoing activities by implementing or resource partners, philanthropic bilateral donors, academia, civil society, and so on. In other words, we examine the broad set of stakeholders in partnerships to see how activities or outcomes were continuing. Now, a few notes before we dive into some of the initial findings and the framework at Earnest. The Enduring Results 3.0 study largely draws from partnership stakeholder perspectives for whether partnership results endured or not, and their impressions on the characteristics or activities that led to sustainability and scale. But to be clear, the study was not a comprehensive examination of all of USAID's partnerships or approaches to engage the private sector. Private sector partnerships are just one way that USAID engages the private sector. The study is also not a comparative assessment of whether private sector partnerships produce more or better results than partnerships that do not include private sector actors. It's not an impact assessment of the partnerships, and it doesn't evaluate the quality of the results produced. It's not a statistically significant causal analysis about what leads or contributes to enduring results, although we do probe those factors without that statistical significance. And it's not a comparison of enduring versus non-enduring partnerships. The study was limited by the sample size, but the study benefited from deep multi-stakeholder interview process that really let us explore partnerships across the region in a unique way. But importantly, just because a characteristic was correlated with the partnership scaling, it does not create a causal relationship. It does, however, provide some hypotheses to explore a little bit further. So moving on to the research methodology. The findings from the study are primarily based on the documented research and interviews across 29 different partnerships in the study sample. To gather data and information for this study, the research team gathered information from a number of different perspectives, from USAID, from implementing partners, from private sector actors. We also sought out partnership documentation, such as MOUs, evaluations, or reports, or other documents produced under the engagement. The team used this document research to feed into the interviews that we had with partnership stakeholders. Fortunately, as you can see, we had really great participation in the interviews, interviewing 100% of USAID contacts in partnerships, 90% of implementing partners in partnerships, and 55% of private sector partners. Private sector contacts were often the most difficult to identify for us, however, as staff turnover, organizational changes, and availability of data often made it difficult to identify a viable contact. Now, the coverage for our interviews was quite good, but there are some inherent limitations of interviews that I mentioned earlier. Things like interview bias, although interviewing multiple partners and getting different perspectives help cross-validate our data, we recognize the very real risk of interview bias stemming from participants in an organization and our role wanting to portray the effects or outcomes in a certain way. The partnership engagement challenges, in many cases, multiple stages of outreach were required to identify partnership points of contact from within USAID. And selection bias within the sample. We're very aware that people might be more willing to talk about the partnerships if those partnerships had enduring or scaled results. So with those factors in mind, I really think that gives better context for some of the things that we try to work around in the study itself. So one of the things that I wanted to take time to do was look at our integrated framework for the analysis itself. Continuing on with the methodology, this diagram shows our analytical framework. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we took the data that we collected through our various input sources and worked from the bottom up to identify thematic areas and key characteristics found to influence partnership sustainability and scale. We identified 11 thematic areas across 3 stages of partnership: design, implementation, and post-partnership. So looking at these concentric circles here, you can see that in the design phase, we examined pre-existing relationships between partners, private sector initiation of partnerships, commercial interest and core capabilities alignment, and market-oriented approaches and design. In the implementation phase, we looked at steering committees and governance of partnerships, partnership duration, the local versus private sector partners, and monitoring and evaluation of partnership activities. And finally, in the post-partnership phase, we examined the partnership contributions, host government role, and beneficiary engagement. Now, those are all key characteristics that we examined in the interviews, and we talked about and kind of lead to or drive kind of conversations around what leads to sustaining results. I also want to point out that the outer ring here has both the pathways to sustain and the platforms to scale. And what we mean by that is outside of the characteristics that actually drove engagement or might be worth examining in further detail, we also wanted to examine how partnerships sustained or scaled over time. So let's examine that a little bit further right now. So when the research team found that the partnership had sustained or scaled post-partnership, we further examined how. In order to provide structure, we identified 5 common pathways to scale and then coded the partnerships in our dataset accordingly. Here you can see the most common pathways for partnerships to sustain was building capacity or establishing capacity building activities. This category captures potential behavior change through industry-specific training and access to distinct knowledge or tools, either during or post-partnership. For example, if a partnership develops labor training and programs to fill a skills gap within a market, these training programs might then sustain, funded by employers who benefit from the availability of new skills in the market, or in some cases by future employees who have a greater likelihood of obtaining jobs following the training. The second most common pathway to scale among partnerships was establishing or expanding market linkages. Now, this occurred when market relationships and/or market exposure was created. For example, a partnership might establish connections between value chain actors such that it reduces search costs or offtake risk. Now, in addition to the pathways to scale, we also examined the ways that partnerships had achieved scale. And by scale, we mean increasing the size or effective activities or outcomes that stem from the partnership period activities. The platform that we saw most commonly lead to scale was market-based outcomes and activities, which refers to a platform with profit-seeking behavior by new or existing private sector actors or partnership beneficiaries were described by interviewees as a powerful driver of scale. Market-driven activities and relationships typically have financial sustainability and growth as primary objectives. Now, Usaid partnerships might support the development of these market-based relationships, for example, by linking buyers and sellers in a market where there is a desire for continued profitability and expansion. Now, if you're curious to read a little bit more about the definitions for these different pathways and platforms to scale, I would invite you to, again, there's a really great section in the external summary and at the bottom of the annex that goes into a little bit more detail on what we mean by each of these pathways and platforms. But now, in addition to examining the brief summary of the mechanics of sustaining or scaling, I also wanted to highlight a few specific findings about the characteristics of these relationships from the report. So I'll remind you that we explored 11 characteristics in earnest that were identified by interviewees across multiple interviews. So I'm just going to discuss a few of them today because we don't have time to dive into all of them. So you can see that I've identified a few of these that are highlighted in gold that might be of specific interest to this audience and we found particularly interesting. So we'll look a little bit about the characteristics in partnership design, about commercial interests and core capabilities alignment. We'll look at market-oriented approaches. In the partnership design and implementation phases, we'll look at partner size and reach. And finally, in the post-partnership design and implementation phases, we'll look at partner contributions. So one of the first areas that we explored was the commercial interest and core capabilities. Now, what do we mean by alignment with private sector actors' core capabilities? We're referring to key capabilities of the private sector actor, such as sales, distribution network, marketing, or other key capabilities that that business might have. Based on the data that we collected, private sector partners more often continued to scale partnership activities that were aligned to their core capabilities. One example of this was the Kosovo Credit Guarantee Fund partnership, where local banks had engaged to provide business loans to small and medium-sized enterprises, with the fund covering 50% of the risk. Partnership activities were highly aligned to the core capabilities of the bank, such as loan disbursement, and the partnership enabled them to expand their business to new customer segments. Activities have sustained through the continued action of the fund and additional banks, and they've also scaled to new financial products. Now, next year, on the second bullet point, you can see that in our limited data set, private sector partners more often continued activities after USAID funding ended when the partnership aligned with their commercial interests. Private sector partners were identified to have a commercial interest in a partnership when the identified outcomes enabled the private sector to either increase their revenues, improve their operational efficiency, and/or reduce their risk of conducting a commercial business. So one example of this was the Uganda Value-Added Maize Alliance, where AgroWays, a private sector actor, wanted to increase their sales by establishing linkages with local farmers and selling maize to local breweries and other off-takers. AgroWays helped the local farmers increase their production and quality of maize by providing them training and consultation. Because of their continued commercial interest, they continued these activities after USAID funded, increasing their sales substantially. They're now expanding their model in a few new markets as well. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about market-oriented approaches. Market-oriented approaches contribute to the development outcomes by either addressing barriers in existing markets or by creating or catalyzing new markets. So these partnerships often focus on activities that include, but are not limited to, buying, selling, or profit-driven interactions, either at the partner or beneficiary levels, such as making connections between the producers and buyers or between distributors and end customers. So one finding within our sample was that market-oriented approaches scaled more often than non-market-oriented approaches. And again, this is working from a limited data set, but informed by those stakeholder interviews. Further, partnerships with market-oriented approaches often scaled without involvement of additional partners or donors. They primarily scaled through continued involvement from the private sector partners or through beneficiaries once USAID funding ended. In contrast, non-market-oriented partnerships often required involvement from other partners, such as the host government, other donors, or civil society organizations. This is a standard scale. So one example of this was the Keystone Agribit partnership, a market-oriented partnership where USAID and implementing partners collaborated with local millers and producers to create upstream and downstream connections to smallholder farmers. They linked the off-takers and agro-input dealer to the farmers in the region. These market linkages continue to exist and drive benefits for both private sector partners as well as beneficiaries once USAID funding ended. So exploring a little bit further with these sub-bullet points here, market-oriented partnerships often sustained through establishing market linkages or enabling new customer segments, where non-market-oriented partnerships often sustained more often through broader practice or policy changes or enabling new products or services. Next, we'll look a little bit about partner size and reach. When we're talking about partner size and reach, we're looking at the local partners versus global private sector partners in terms of the scope and size of the business. Based on the data that we collected, local private sector partners more often continued their contributions in our sample once USAID funding ended, and their interest was often commercial in nature. In the study, we didn't drill down deep enough to really truly understand all the motivations of local private sector actors in scaling partnerships, but it's worth noting that local private sector actors are often rooted in their communities and invested in local markets. For example, in a partnership between USAID and Almatalia, a local private training and outsourcing company, provided trainings to job seekers and helped them get placed into jobs. The partnership supported the private sector in conducting trainings more effectively by providing better training materials and devices, thereby attracting more people to join private sector actors' training and programs. Given the commercial benefits from these activities, the private sector partner has increased and continued to increase the training materials and learnings from the partnership to train over 3,000 additional job seekers since 2017. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about partner contributions. The partner contributions characteristic explored the role of contributions from partners, both financial and non-financial. Based on partnership interviews and documentation, it was found that highly distinctive private sector contributions facilitated scaling. Now, by high distinctiveness, I mean the contributions were unique and other contributions were unlikely to achieve the same results. For example, brand value, relationships, proprietary information that are really unique to a private sector actor, instead of just providing strict funding that might have been provided by a number of different actors. For example, in the Ghana Advanced Maize Seed Adoption Partnership, the private sector contributed to a highly distinctive asset in the form of a specific type of hybrid maize seed, different from seeds that are traditionally used in the local market. Now, this required distinctive expertise from the collaborating business. The demonstration of higher yields from such seeds to the farmers increased adoption of the seeds and encouraged the national government to ease import restrictions on the seeds, enabling the scaling of activities and outcomes post-partnership. Now, with that, I promised that I would not drone on for too long before the panel discussion. I did just want to go through a few of the key characteristics and the integrated framework that we use for this particular study. But certainly, with the experience of the panelists, I think that there's much more engaging conversation that we can get into. And I would encourage you to certainly go to usaid.gov to see the external summary report, which I believe was also linked in the SID invite that was sent out yesterday. So with that, Mike, I'll plan to stop sharing my screen now and pass it back to you to moderate the conversation.
Great, thank you, Todd. Thanks for sharing. And I put the link to the report in the chat, so please do take a moment to go through it. All of the content that Todd shared is provided in the report in more detail, and a number of other points that I'm sure you could drill into. The first question I'd like to ask is to Todd, and to really understand, what was the intention that USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub has in pursuing the Enduring Results Study? What are the insights that you're trying to gain from it, and how will the study enforce or change the way that your private sector engagement strategy is being implemented?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And thanks again for the Society for International Development and the Corporate Role and Development Working Group for hosting this event. I forgot to mention that earlier. And as many of you know, USAID issued a private sector engagement policy back in December of 2018. The policy ingrained PSE evidence building as a key operating principle for the agency. And we worked hard as an extension of that operating principle to define an evidence and learning strategy or plan for the agency that was specifically focused on private sector engagement. Now, that was put into place in 2019, and it was also a key question in the agency-wide learning agenda that we issued for the agency. Three of the major questions that we had in our evidence and learning plan, or the priority questions that we were looking at, was how and to what extent does private sector engagement improve development and humanitarian outcomes? Number two was context-specific factors that drive effective engagement with the private sector. And the third was what PSE relationship qualities influence results. And we think that those three aspects of engagement, how to what extent, the context, the relationship qualities, are critical to understanding how to achieve success with the private sector and toward our development and humanitarian ends. We wanted to continue this Enduring Results study because we really think it's important to address these priority questions. For example, in this study, we continued to develop the evidence base for the importance of market-based approaches and local partners in the long-term sustainability of programming. Although the study was not a thorough quantitative analysis looking to identify statistically significant determinants of sustainability and scalability, the sample that we did study works to shine a light on some of the mechanics of those sustainability and scalability. Another example in this line of inquiry around relationships is that the study helped to shine a light on the importance of pre-existing relationships between donors and private sector actors, and the importance of aligning interests between those two actors. These are two important aspects of engagement that are often intuitive, but it's excellent to have some data to back up this intuition. To the broader question about filling knowledge gaps across the agency, that is something that we continue to work towards. Over the past few years, we have developed products to share knowledge within and outside of USAID across effectively partnering with the private sector. For example, we launched the Pse Evidence Gap Map back in 2020. Most of you who are on this call can probably do a Google search for Pse Evidence Gap Map and find a link to that, which is an interactive tool in which users can filter available evidence by various criteria such as geography, sector, or approach. I would encourage those of you who haven't browsed the map to view it, but really what the Evidence Gap Map does is paint a picture of the repository of evidence that already exists at the agency to try to start to synthesize that information in a meaningful way. We see the Enduring Results study as a really unique kind of cross-region study that isn't always incentivized to be created, at a mission specifically. So I think it helps to fill in these broader holes, looking at a higher level perspective than many of the other studies that are in the Evidence Gap Map.
Great, thanks, Todd. Maybe if I could pass to our other panelists and maybe start with Joy. I'm curious if you could share with us some of the maybe insights that resonated with you, or how your experience either aligns with or maybe contradicts some of the findings that we have.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, SID, for organizing this this panel. So Todd talked a little bit about past relationships and saying they were intuitive, and I actually found that a little bit, I don't know, I guess it was surprising for me to see it written out, and that someone had actually, you know, really had some evidence against that. I mean, it is true, it is intuitive. A lot of partnerships with USAID came about because someone at a table just said, oh, I have an idea. And that really speaks to those past relationships, that we're having these conversations even at times when we don't have an active partnership happening. And those relationships do spark these conversations that that really help us to find places that are mutually beneficial to our stakeholders. So that was a little bit surprising for me to see that. I would say that the things that I felt were the most that I was the most gratified to see in the report were governance, steering committee, the importance of having a steering committee, and monitoring evaluation. I think these two things were among the most difficult things for us to find agreement on in our past relationships and partnerships with USAID. Setting up a steering committee, who's making decisions, who has the power to influence, you know, our direction, and also what is it we're actually measuring, and you know, because that brings up a lot about transparency. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but to keep my answer short and hear from the other panels, I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Joy. Leslie, could you share a little bit about, you know, how the report resonated with you, and maybe fits with or maybe doesn't fit with the experience that you have with CRS?
Thank you so much, Mike. And it was very interesting to hear the result of the study. The results of the study reflects our experience in three terms. First, for our experience, it has been more successful creating market-driven partnerships. One example that we have is the creation of a partnership with Intelligentsia Coffee, connecting them with small-scale specialty coffee producers, exchanging technical assistance, and incorporating these coffee producers to the coffee value chain. This was an exchange of the core capacities from the producer groups and from the coffee company. I also believe that the pre-existing relationships with companies, it's something that really gives the opportunity for, in our case, implementing partners to propose partnerships to the private sector. The pre-existing relationships gives the opportunity. It's not the only way to create a partnership. It's only the way the door opens to propose a partnership. And this is what resonates with us. And lastly, when we started proposing partnerships for our project, we have a big pipeline of opportunities to create partnerships. And when we were proposing these partnerships, and we were envisioning connecting through CSR with private sector, we also found out that it was feasible to build those partnerships, but less scalable and with less opportunities to grow. So we continued from this experience connecting with those private sector companies that had something in common with the communities that we represent. We represent 200 communities, and when there was an opportunity of working together and creating a partnership that was a win-win opportunity, that was successful for us. So this is what for us, what resonates best with us, with our experience, and we can see the benefits of targeting market-driven partnerships, capitalize on existing relationships, and work together with the private sector on building together these shared value partnerships. So this is what I saw that we have in common with the results of the study.
Great, thank you, Leslie. David, how about you? How does your experience at the USAID mission in Georgia fit within the context of the study results?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I mean, I read a couple of times the report, and every time I was reading, it was full of interesting details like numbers as well as comparison. And I was trying to compare to what is reality in our case. And I would say everything seemed quite relevant. Of course, sometimes numbers were indicating that might be interesting to try. And for me, it was interesting that 100% of local partnerships had commercial agenda when only 29% of global partnerships had that. And of course, that means multiple things, but it gives clear indication that commercial agenda is a critical, specifically for local, maybe smaller scale businesses than global ones to initiate. So that was something interesting. I just recorded in my notes. The second one was about relationship, and it was quite well mentioned, and it was also asked in the chat box that frequently our partners, implementing partners, are key in initiating the relationships with local as well as international partners. So they are ones who are bringing linkages, or at least we're bringing. So in Georgia, we are bringing more relationship on our level for last 6 months, and luckily we have great support from Beverly, who joined us a few months ago, and she takes more relationship on USAID level. But up to now, a lot of relationships are started with partners, and I would say the role is a crucial at the beginning as well as during implementation. And if I also mentioned third one, which is a 3ER, which seems kind of critical time to see sustainability of partnership. And frankly, we have to start from small steps, because frequently businesses which might be interesting partners for us in Georgia as well as other don't know much about USAID or what USAID is doing and why. Yes, we have businesses with whom we interacted for years and they know, but frequently good, interesting partnerships are coming from businesses who had no linkage with us, and they need to test a relationship. They need to test the kind of way of working together. And I would say 3R is reasonable time to expect next level, which might be much bigger or much more interesting, and of course, much more comprehensive. So that's all in case of my opinions of the report.
Thank you, David. And I know, I think you've already answered one of the questions that was in the chat about the role of implementing partners. And I think it even though there's some points within the study about how private sector initiated partnerships differentiate from non-private sector initiated, I think to your point, partnerships can come from anywhere, and the implementing partners play such an important role in the work that USAID does. And so sometimes they're your arms and legs in creating some of these. Maybe if I could come back to Joy, and there's so much spoken about shared value with respect to public-private partnerships. I'd be curious your experience in finding and cultivating and nurturing conversations around shared value and developing relationships where you can actually find that shared value that might lead to a collaboration that is effective for both parties or multiple parties. You're on mute now, Joy.
I have dogs.
Yeah.
So first, I would like to just mention that yes, shared value, finding shared value is really the platform upon which everything else is built. And Johnson & Johnson has a number of partnerships with USAID, including drug donation partnerships like bedaquiline, pharmacovigilance and capacity building in HIV, drug detection, disease detection with TB, advocacy with the Frontline Health Workers Coalition, and the partnership that I led was in maternal and child health called Survive and Thrive, and that actually started with Helping Babies Breathe and went on for almost a decade. So we have a variety of different kinds of partnerships, and there are really 4 things that I think are really important in developing shared value, and it's intent, transparency, trust, and time. And I'll repeat them: intent, transparency, trust, and time. And, you know, we need to start. Private sector does not necessarily have the same intent that USAID has, or that our country host governments have, or you know, or that even our the people that we serve have. And I think it's really important to start out discussing the intent of every partner. Why are you joining this partnership? What are you, you know, what do you hope to get out of it? Transparency. This is really what is your mutual definition of impact? And, you know, what are your motivations behind this work? And I think I mentioned earlier, monitoring and evaluation, how important that is. And it is one very quantitative way to get to those more qualitative challenges. You know, if we're really talking about the data that we need, it really helps to open up in terms of transparency. And then trust and time, they go a little bit hand in hand. You know, over time, you do build that relationship of trust, and that really helps you to, you know, to expand your partnerships, to build those partnerships, and to really evolve them into future other partnerships. I did want to go back though to mentioning that I was surprised by the past relationships a little bit, in a good way. But I did want to make sure that if there were those on the call who have not had a past relationship with USAID, not to be discouraged. It's not, I don't think it's imperative that you have a past relationship, but certainly it becomes easier and easier as the partners get to know each other.
Oh, thanks, Joy. And I've written down your 4 pieces there. I think it's so interesting, especially the piece about intentionality and motivation. And I think, you know, one of the things that can be challenging in this space is recognizing, you know, and having an appreciation that we can all work on the same thing, but have different reasons for being there. And if you can trust in that, and be okay with that somebody may have a profit motivation, somebody may have an impact motivation, but those 2 things can be mutually reinforcing and get us to a better place together. And I think those kind of nuances, you know, really come with experience, and I appreciate those thoughts. Maybe if I'll come back to Leslie, David, and then kind of circle back to Todd. You know, Leslie and David, I would be interested in each of your thoughts on how you, either locally as an implementer or locally as USAID, cultivate relationships with the private sector, especially recognizing what Joy said about the need for time, the need to have patience and to build trust. How do you invest time to get there, recognizing that every relationship that you invest time in maybe does not result in some collaboration? Leslie?
Thank you, Mike. Interesting question, because this is what requires time investment the most, but it's the most valuable action. From CRS experience in Guatemala, the asset that we had as implementing partner is that we had a position with a network of private sector actors because of the services that we provide in Guatemala. We had pre-existing relationships with construction companies, with inputs providers, and with technical assistance providers also. And within this network of private companies, we had a position as experts in the fields that we do. So that starts the trust in CRS to start the conversation. But when beginning with this challenge of leveraging funds from the private sector, what we saw first was the need of co-creating with them, start asking questions to them before implementing our project. the questions, engaging them in the questions to create the strategy of private sector engagement that we currently implement, I think was a smart action to understand what were the expectations, to continue leveraging this trust, to invest it in our current project. And when asking these questions to the private sector companies, we could learn that it wasn't the same to invite them to collaborate or invite them to donate. It wasn't the same to invite them to plan together. We understood that they wanted to be part of the project, implementing together with us and finding their correct role there. Each company had a different role to play, but asking the questions to them, involving them in our designing of the partnerships, that was key for us. And I think connecting to the first question you did, this started the trust, making them part of how things were being designed. It's making possible that now they are being part of the implementation. So this is what I would comment on starting these relationships.
No, that's great. Thank you, Leslie. David, what about you?
I'm thinking how to answer, because there are many different corners. I would say maybe a couple. For example, and of course, relationship modality in case of us is changing. We were using different logic. Now we are doing it differently. But clearly, from one side, we are trying to show successful cases to our, let's say, new partners, explaining what we mean under partnership. And frequently, the global companies we partner, like whether it would be BP or Ferrero or Universal and others, are quite easy cases just to explain, because it's much easier to establish partnership with big names because they understand better our agenda, and it's easier to start as well. But anyway, so from one side, we are trying to show successful models and explain. For us, key is to help Georgians to have more high-value jobs, and I know it's key for you as well, or have more income. So kind of demonstrating that we are here not just to benefit us, but yeah, we are here to benefit them as a businesses or their stakeholders or beneficiaries. And initially they're asking why and things like that, but with time, I think that gets a little bit easier. So that's one. Second, of course, I'm feeling more and more that we expect primarily no major contribution from their side, if not in kind, as an initial step, because whenever we speak about cash, I know they are getting a little bit more sensitive, and I can tell two examples, quite recent ones. So we have a discussion with one of the interesting Georgian enterprise who built multiple hotels, and they are one of the big one. And I saw they had independent CSR resources. And I was kind of asking, by the way, what is about your CSR logic? We don't have CSR budget as such. We incorporate CSR in our investments. We do energy efficiency somewhere, or we do gender issues somewhere. So meaning they are trying to use CSR also to benefit their core business. So that was easy to understand their modality and also bringing back. So another example, which I had also from last week, and I would say probably asking open questions is a good starting point to help them to see their value or see their role. So we helped through our one of the project linking 53 businesses and helping them to find 100 interns for their business, whether ICT, audit company, or construction company. And during the event we had last week, they were telling, for us, it was excellent support because we have jobs, but we cannot find people. And someone advising like right candidate was big help. And this was done through NGO, local NGO. And this was another question which is asked. So, I was chatting during the coffee break, by the way, would you be willing to help that NGO to do similar program in future? Like, for example, can ICT company contribute with artificial intelligence modality to help to screen from 2,000 applicants to best 100? And they told, yes, we see value and we are ready. So for me, this is kind of different modalities we have. And as I mentioned, there might be another 5 or 6 similar approaches. And another modality might also be trying to engage past beneficiaries who grew to the next level as a potential partner and linking them to the supply chain better, or linking them to the market chains better, because they know and they understand, and they are also strong enough not to expect same type of benefit from US government and see a much more commercial agenda in working with us.
That's interesting. Thank you, David. It's interesting. One of the, it actually makes me think of a different example, but both Leslie and David's comments, I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that even taking small steps with private sector engagement, you don't need to be in search of the ribbon cutting. It doesn't have to be the big thing, but through small engagements can lead to different engagement that can lead to follow-on engagements. And I think it fits within the context of what Joy was saying earlier about building trust and taking time, is that by kind of learning a little bit about each other, you can go from doing several small things to doing something more transformational. Todd, I'd like to come back to you and ask you, given your experience with ERS 3.0, where would you like to see future iterations of this report evolve? Are there specific areas or insights that you kind of got a flavor for in 3.0 that you would like to really further unpack? And even are there methodological issues or changes or what have you that you would like to try to overcome?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's certainly something that we've thought about quite a bit as we continue to look for ways to create consistent, comparable, meaningful data and insights on what works and what doesn't work in PSE. What I'll say is that the Enduring Results series is a really good complement to the other knowledge projects that we've created in the past. We've gathered some great, albeit limited, evidence on the drivers of sustainability and scale in this study series, and we really have been thinking about how to iterate and refine a potential version 4.0 of this study series. I think one of the things that we recognize through this study process, and hopefully something that we can learn from and apply in future studies, is that one of the limitations is having a strong foundation of data available at the onset of the actual exercise or the study itself. I think it's a good reminder that after a partnership has ended, it's sometimes very hard to actually dig up those old files and actually look for all the information pertinent to those particular partnerships. So I think that as a unit and USAID, we've really been thinking about how to create systems and tools in order to better capture that data more systematically, so that we're starting from a better point in the future, which I think is really important. And honestly, outside of any methodological changes of the study itself, I see that as like a really critical piece in pursuing a future iteration of this particular study. And second, I think that one of the things that we're thinking about doing is adapting our integrated framework over time. This was a really interesting approach in identifying the characteristics that were cited across multiple interviews that people thought had an effect on the sustainability and scale of partnerships. Some of the key characteristics, such as the duration of the partnership, that was cited across multiple interviews as a factor that might have led to sustainability or scale, but we're not exactly sure that that's the right fit in the overarching integrated framework. I think that, as I mentioned in the presentation, these findings really provide a good set of hypotheses to work from. So I really do think that we'll try to hammer down into some of these findings in a little bit more detailed way, building on the hypothesis that we have here. Some of the ones that are of particular interest to me personally are core competencies or core capabilities in commercial interest and alignment. And that goes back to what we had mentioned earlier in this panel conversation on what is the motivation or intent behind private sector actors. I think that as long as the motivation and intent is clear, I think it's completely acceptable that people have different motivations there. So ultimately, when we actually think about data collection and how to do that more systematically, and when we think about adapting this integrated framework and building on the hypothesis that we have, I think that our ultimate goal is to be able to generalize some of the findings to a broader context. This provides a starting point. This study that we released, it provides a starting point, but it's not the authoritative source on how to craft a private sector partnership to ensure sustainability and scale. I don't know for sure if that will ever be a product that anyone can ever produce, but I do think that there's some work that we can do to generalize the study in a more meaningful way. And I think that one of the things that we've also been thinking about is how to translate these findings into recommendations. The way that we frame it to USAID staff are, this provides a really great set of considerations for you to make when you're actually engaging in the design of a partnership, to say, hey, think about the core capabilities of a partner, think about their motivation, and think about those things in the context of sustainability and scale over time. And so I think that when it comes to translating things from recommendations and considerations and really making that a key feature in the partnership design process, that's something that we're going to be doing more actively as well. So those are just some of the initial thoughts that come to mind when thinking about a future 4.0. Thanks,
Todd. That's really helpful, and I think that concept of thinking about characteristics versus like a roadmap is probably the right way, given the variability of partnerships. I will say, please keep the questions coming in. I'm going to do one more quick round robin, and then we're going to spend the last 30 minutes on your questions. I'm going to come back to Leslie first and ask, how has USAID's focus on private sector engagement, both articulated in the private sector engagement strategy, as well as in criteria for development of cooperative agreements or contracts, change the way that either CRS or you specifically think about how to approach the private sector when you're either implementing or developing new programs?
Thank you, Mike. Definitely, these expectations, these challenges that we have on leveraging resources and working together with the private sector has changed our way to act. First, I will begin mentioning, I mentioned in the last question that in the past, we used to think about the private sector related to donations, to collaboration. But the opportunity of co-designing with the private sector changed our way to think about them by learning about their expectations of wanting to be part of the project implementation and not only a financial contributor. So we switched from asking their support to making them a partner and creating a project and an opportunity to create a project together. As a result, we changed from expecting donation of, as an example, of $20,000 to mobilize over $7.3 million in investment in different fields, in construction, in agriculture value chains, in technical assistance. And we changed now to act as an expert for the private sector companies when they are interested in building a partnership with us and USAID through the project. We are now acting as advisors because we know the geographic areas, we know the needs, the productive potentialities, we understand risks, and this is what makes us good advisors for the communities that we represent, and also good advisor for the private sector to help them understand what opportunities can be found in the fields and in the communities that we represent. And maybe I will finish the how we changed our way to approach. So instead of inviting them to collaborate, now we are playing, I would say, 3 roles. We are acting as brokers. This is a new experience for us. We are acting as liaisons with the communities and also as voice amplifiers for the private sector and for the communities, because both may be distanced because of the different roles they have in society. So this is the way we changed. We need, in order to act like this, we need to change, acquire staff capabilities. We needed to write a strategy. We needed to also construct our language based on what now we are proposing to the private sector. But In conclusion, acquiring these three roles that I mentioned, acting as brokers, as liaisons, as voice amplifiers, is something that changed the way we used to approach to the private sector. This is what I would share about your question, Mike. Thank you.
No, I love that. And I love that one of the roles was not fundraiser, as I think sometimes that's one of the challenges in approaching the private sector is that's the view sometimes that you are received with. Not always, but Joy, one last question for you before we open up. What do you see as maybe barriers for engagement with USAID or constraints? You've clearly had successes in engaging, but the constraints in actually putting together these sorts of collaborations, and are there things that you would like to see change?
Yes, I think that one of our big challenges, and it became a barrier in some countries, was really a requirement to be country-owned and country-led. This was one of the core values of Survive and Thrive, and we wanted to align with national health priorities. But if you can imagine, Survive and Thrive, ultimately our focus was really improving maternal and child health, and we were doing that on the systems-based facilities with professional societies. Ultimately, we had 19 partners and 30 host governments involved. This is a huge collaboration, and you can definitely see how our values, inclusiveness was the first value, country-owned and country-led. That was both a very important value for sustainability, but also a barrier. There were times when some of the partners said, that country is not a priority for me. A country that was saying, we want this in our, we want this to happen. It aligns with our national priorities. So it was hard to make sure that our investments were aligning with country priorities. Our third value was shared results and recognition. That was pretty unique and was actually an enabler rather than a barrier, because all of the partners loved that everything was shared. And the final, which I've never been able to successfully have in any other partnership, was brand non-exclusivity. And when I say that, so, and again, it would have been a barrier for many organizations to take part if we're saying, look, there's no brand exclusivity here. But it became very much an enabler. And this particular collaboration with USAID produced a ton of intellectual property. And all of that intellectual property is branded only with the name of the GDA, not with individual partners. So I look at these partnerships sometimes as being on a diet, Mike. So, I really have trouble dieting when I have to know what I can't have. Like, you can't have cake, you can't have cookies, but I find it a lot easier if I say, what do I get? What can I have? What is on the menu? And I think that idea of shared recognition and brand non-exclusivity was a huge enabler, which helped us to bring so many partners. We ended up with $120 million of investment over the 5 years, of which about a third of it was cash.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic, Joy. And I think the idea, and I think, highlighted in the report, is this idea of, in some ways, cash isn't king. Cash is a criteria. It's an indication, I think, both from the private sector and USAID, that there's a willingness to invest. But cash isn't the most distinctive resource. USAID's got cash, private sector's got cash, and so ultimately it's often the things that are not cash that are really what make things transformative. One last question, David. I'm curious, your experience locally in Georgia, how it differs engaging maybe with what would be perceived as the local private sector, the Georgian private sector, either SMEs, business associations, larger businesses in Georgia versus maybe large multinationals. Have you found that experience as different, the same, challenges on one versus the other?
I kind of little bit covered little bit this point, but as I wanted to highlight again, I don't know how in the case of other missions, but for us, probably working with international names or global names is maybe easier at this stage. And why? So sometimes they come with resources which we value. Yes, for us, cash is not critical, but frequently it's kind of good starting point for conversation. They have clearly development agenda in their work, whether it would be developing community next to the pipeline they are running, or willingness to support local people doing the like for the film sector, because they were filming Fast and Furious in Georgia during this summer. So they kind of better understand what we can contribute, what they can contribute, and why more broader development is critical. When speaking about local ones, as I highlighted, they primarily see commercial agenda, which is great, but frequently they sometimes think that they should be kind of beneficiaries. So for us, like line between beneficiary and kind of partner is like discussion we have to do. Yes, we want to work with you, but you are larger scale business. So we want to work with you as a partner. Yes, you will benefit if you will have more people trained, if there will be stronger association, you will be a member, if there will be like services which you can benefit, but we don't want to consider you as a direct beneficiary. And they understand this with time, but as I mentioned, it's much more time consuming for them. And there is another probably possibility. Frequently, international managers of global companies are also better linked with like an American Chamber of Commerce. They know chief of party of like projects, so they also are easier, or linkages are much easier with them. They speak good English. They are coming back with nicely written proposals, which is another kind of milestone of that relationship. But as I mentioned, we use international or global partnerships as a model to demonstrate to local ones. And currently, the stage where we are struggling is how to build trust between players, because one is trust between us and partners, but sometimes we need to help 5, 6 sector players to work together. And that's what we are trying to do through associations, finding joint agenda, which might be skills development. And for me, this is not only like having partnerships, but also helping local businesses to better understand the role and kind of, because one of the key role probably and all would be is to facilitate the process. And we are probably quite good in that, us as the USAID or our partners, because sometimes even I'm telling to businesses what to do because we know much more than someone who just entered the country. So I hope I understood your point.
No, you did. Thank you, David. I'm going to go now to some of the questions that have come in from the audience, and please feel free. We'll take questions right up until the end. The first question that I'm going to choose is, can you please share a bit more on how private sector players are engaged influences the sustainability or scalability of projects? So this idea of like, how does the way that the engagement starts influence sustainability or scalability? Maybe Todd, I don't know if you want to first take a crack at that, and then I'll give others a shot to chime in if they want to add something.
Yeah, and to answer some of that question, I think that we have that kind of sphere or circle around partnership design that includes things like partnership initiation and pre-existing relationships. And so the question about like how someone is engaged, I think that there's a lot of merits like reading through that section to understand like what is the value of that pre-existing relationship? What is the value of that particular like design characteristics of a partnership that might lead to more sustainability and scale over time? I think that when considering a partnership, like those pieces of the design puzzle, which will ultimately determine kind of the activities or like associated pieces of the partnership, are really key to kind of like consider at the beginning of the particular partnership. If that kind of gets to that question, I think it's one of those things where like like understanding like alignment with core capabilities or commercial interests is easy to say. It's a little bit harder to do in practice. But I think in general, the report tries to just reinforce that regardless of what the partnership activities are, the considerations that you want to make or consider during that design phase are important.
Great, thanks, Todd. Joy, do you have any thoughts on that about how the engagement starts or how private sectors are engaged influences the sustainability and scale?
I think Todd had a lot to say about that, and so did Leslie earlier. And for us, you know, the first thing, and I'm going to keep going back to that, you know, previous relationship and how do you start? I really do want to make sure that people on this call don't feel like without a previous relationship, there's no hope. But I do believe that all of those conversations start with where do we want to land rather than where do we want to begin. And so any conversation that we've had about sustainability has really started with that. What do we have to build that will be country owned and country led? And I know that there are some feelings about how working with private sector, whether we're going to work with the philanthropic area of private sector, whether we're going to work with the business end of private sector. And clearly, you know, when you're working with the business end of private sector, you know, they're really looking for sustainability because it's about growing their markets or introducing new markets. And that is true. I would say that there is also in the CSR and philanthropy area, the ability to be sustainable as well. And that really has to do with how you set up your projects to begin with. And I do think that USAID can be a huge influencer in that by engaging the host country missions.
No, that's helpful. And I think the point about where you engage with a private sector actor is so critical to understand. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier about incentives, you know, that the business side of the private sector has a different set of internal incentives than the CSR versus the corporate foundation. But I think the point you make is right, which is that doesn't mean that you should only focus on the business, because it's actually the CSR and foundation somewhere that can be your entry point into a relationship that connects you to the business. And so I think, at least my own experience, sometime being in the development space, I think oftentimes when you try to engage with the private sector, you tend to be shunted over to the CSR or the foundation side because they're like, that's the side that deals with that, even though you have a commercially oriented idea. But I think, you know, I guess the one piece of advice I'd give people is don't be discouraged by that, because starting one place can get you someplace else. So another question somebody asked if I could present is, any thoughts from the panel on the points of convergence on the other side, divergence related to market systems approach and variety of approaches to private sector engagement, you know, that are coming out of the study? Do we see any sort of, you know, convergence towards market systems approach, divergence, you know, away? Any things that we see that are becoming more consistent? Maybe I don't know if any of the panelists feel compelled to want to take a crack at that.
I can just give simply like point about commercial element, or that local partners, for example, they do partnership because of commercial agenda. That's for me is a market linkages. So technically they do mostly ones which is a market linkages. And we have cases when like they need to grow and they need supply behind, or they need quality standards, or they need like better understand the market. So I would say yes, it's studied clearly states that, and that's what we also see in case of our reality.
One of the other questions that we had was, any advice on making the case to private sector actors for partnerships that will ultimately support their commercial interests? You know, better skilled workforce, more stabilized social environment, you know, any advice on making the case? Maybe I'll start with Leslie, as I know you've made this case several times, you know, in your role, but then also maybe ask Joy to comment.
Yeah, interesting question. What type of business proposal can we show to a company that is doing their mission and doing it well? I think that the opportunity that we have is to share potentialities of the geographic areas that we represent, and look for the opportunity of the private sector to say what they want to do. You mentioned maybe starting from the philanthropic side and then moving to the business, to the core business of the company. So I believe that we create the case together, because we have an expertise as NGOs, as implementing partners, but the expertise of the private sector is their own. So it's the opportunity that we want to create needs to be co-created, as I believe. Definitely we need previous steps on this. And after the relationships that we've been speaking about, also knowing well the area, mapping the private sector that is present in our area, because everyone has a different role. Some private sector leaders are influencers, others are can operate a business approach in partnerships, other can be just part of a value chain. So understanding who we are speaking with and inviting them to co-create with us, I think that is the opportunity. And there is a list of indicators we would like to just share with the private sector, as in the chat was mentioned, number of new employments created, or a new size of a market, or a new market. But we need to create that together. We are not the business experts. We are the territory experts. So we need to think together, from my point of view.
Thanks, Leslie. Joy, any thoughts from the private sector side on folks making the case for you guys on getting engaged?
Well, I think I'm learning from Leslie.
We all are.
Yeah. I think her comments about really understanding who you're speaking with, because there are different motivations, and I can certainly say from Johnson & Johnson's side that we have all the way across the gamut, and there are many, many shades of color in between a purely philanthropic motivation, and that really has a lot of limitations and requirements behind how that money can be spent. It cannot drive business. It has to have a ring fence around it. But we have everything from that side all the way to pure business, and a lot of things that are in between. I would say the one piece of advice I would add, besides, we have some feedback, or at least I do. Besides Leslie's comments about co-creating and understanding who your audience is, or who you're speaking with, is looking at things over time. So, for instance, in health, and I work primarily in health, we have to think about building the capacity of our health workers and our health systems before we can start looking at products, right? So some of that conversation can say, how do we take the long view for things so that we can build the capabilities on the ground before we start thinking about, our business priorities. And so that would be my only other kind of hint for success.
Great, thank you so much. One last question that I'm going to pull from the audience, and then I will ask each of our panelists to maybe give kind of a few final thoughts before we wrap up. The question was, co-funding private sector actors to contribute to development outcomes, or leveraging funding and other resources from the private sector actors to contribute to development outcomes, which is better or more sustainable from USAID's perspective? So Todd, I think this kind of gets at this idea of how do we incentivize the engagement at some level to begin with? And I know there are a lot of different modalities that aid is used to date. I'm not sure if this study necessarily unpacks that, but maybe if you have thoughts or want to reflect other thoughts from the agency.
Yeah, I would just say that I think it's a really good question, and it really kind of gets at this, private sector development versus private sector engagement, where the lines are, what we mean by each of those pockets of those engagement types. I don't think that there's ever going to be like a perfect answer to that question at a high level. I think that certainly when it comes to funding like beneficiaries, private sector like companies, or when it comes to working with the company on their core business interests and like finding ways to co-fund and implementing partners to implement activities, I think that there certainly is a broad spectrum of the different roles that private sector can play when it comes to how we work with USAID. So I think that I think it's good to note that there's no firm answer to that question. But I think that in reading through the private sector engagement policy and reading through the evidence and learning plan, you can start to get to a picture of the different hats that USAID might play when actually bringing together actors to tackle development challenges collectively, instead of just providing kind of money to private sector actors or more kind of private sector development oriented pieces.
Great, thank you, Todd. And I do want to highlight, there was a comment in the chat that I found particularly insightful and important, and maybe a reaction to something I said about there being almost a false duality between the business side and the CSR. And I agree with that 100%. I think increasingly these lines are blurring, within private sector, where, there used to maybe be CSR over here and the business over here. I think increasingly the private sector recognizes that their customers have a view on how companies operate that is influencing the way that businesses, act. Their investors increasingly have different expectations. The supplier base, has different expectations. And so there are what I view as pressures coming from multiple sides that are ultimately changing the way that businesses operate. And so I think increasingly are going to see the profit-driven side of businesses doing things that maybe 20 years ago we wouldn't have imagined, because there are new pressures that are creating a profit motive to not only seek profit but do the right thing. And so I think we're seeing all sorts of different kind of hybrid varieties there, and I think it's an important point, and one for us to continue to reflect on, and how that changes the way that development actors are trying to interact, and how those trends will lead to new modalities. But maybe if we could, considering there are only 7 minutes left, and I want to respect everybody's time. And first of all, I just want to thank everybody for joining. The fact that we still have 88 people hanging with us here after nearly 90 minutes is really, demonstrates how important the topic is, and how well this panel has kind of been able to help us unpack the topic a little bit. But maybe if I could start with David, and just give each of you a few moments to just give any final thoughts, reflections before we wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, just what comes to mind is what you also mentioned just now. Like PSE is like a quite flexible tool, and I mean, you can find innovations on a daily basis. So meaning that's a major benefit of that, because sometimes it might be working with business to solve their problems, or helping them to create more jobs, or you engaging them to do skills development in the private sector. So for me, that's major benefit of that PSE. And frankly, we are trying to incorporate this into our ongoing projects more and more. And I see quite interesting type of energy in our project, because they are much more motivated to do that type of work even inside our programs than kind of issuing grants or conducting trainings, which was more standard modality they were following. So that's kind of one. Second, as I also highlighted, for me, PSE is not only benefit for us, but also helping like our host countries to have those businesses taking their role in long term. And for me, like we are mentoring them in some way, and that's for me is more critical. And the small steps are more critical as a kind of let's do small by small instead of doing something big, because I had cases when we were declining partnerships because it seemed a little bit small for us. Now we are not doing it that way. So we are trying to find right fit between what we want as well as what is good for the country. So that's probably would be my two additions at the end.
Great, thank you, David. Leslie, would you like to give a few final thoughts?
Sure, thank you, Mike. First, just thank you for the opportunity for organizing this panel. My last comments are that the private sector has always been there during all these years that development has been facilitated by Usaid and other donors. And it's great news to hear that we are learning how to better engage with the private sector and build things together. I do believe that there is still a lot to learn, and this practice of sharing successes and failures is something that I would like to invite everyone to continue doing in our country programs and in the forums that we where we share. And keep in mind that we are doing this because there are a big list of development problems, unsolved problems that have been all the time there also. So the better we continue evaluating how our actions really drive us to solutions to these big development problems, is something that I would like to invite everyone to continue doing, to keep in our mind who are we working for, and keep on track building these partnerships for the future.
Thank you, Leslie. Very well said. Joy, would you like to give a few final thoughts?
Yes, and building on Leslie's comments about who are we working for, and I think about how many times have I sat in on a panel or or listening to panels and heard people talk about seats at the table, and I'm still trying to understand why there are seats at the table, because that is the number of seats seems finite to me, and it shouldn't be. Who are we working for? The table needs to be bigger. And I would just say at this point that, my final words are, let's open up that table. Let's make sure that those people that we are working for are sitting at that table, who are informing us, because I think we need to hear that. The private sector has its own view of how the world is working. USAID has its own view of how the world is working. But for the people who are living it, that may not align in any way with what our views are. And I also, like Leslie's attitude toward the private sector, in that there are a million hidden talents and hidden gems in there that if you spend the time to understand what can be brought to that table with new seats added to it, if you can understand how the private sector works and what assets they have, you really will have a richer, deeper, and more effective partnership.
Thanks so much, Joy. I love the metaphor of the seats at the table and expanding that. I think that's absolutely spot on. Todd, any final thoughts from yourself?
Yeah, and I know we're close to time here, but there's this really great synthesis note on private sector engagement from the Donor Committee for Enterprise Development that talks about whether a general verdict on whether PSE works is even that important in the ultimate scheme of things. because like I think the key thing is that there's a lot of lessons that we can learn about why private sector engagement is valuable in particular context. And I just want to thank everyone today to kind of help collectively work towards that end of acknowledging that PSE is not the answer for everything, but it certainly is effective in promoting development outcomes and private sector interests over time as well. So thank you for participating in this ongoing conversation, and hopefully look forward to crossing paths again in the future.
Thank you to each of our panelists. I want to echo, private sector engagement is a tool. It is not something that we pursue for its own sake. So I am happy that all of you are working towards this, and for everybody who's joined us for today. Paul, maybe I'll give it back to you for final wrap up from SID's perspective.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to Joy, Leslie, David, and Todd for sharing your thoughts on this topic. We really do appreciate it. A few last things to wrap up on. One is that we have my colleague posted a survey in the chat. We really do take your feedback into consideration when we develop our events. So please feel free to fill it out. We really would appreciate any thoughts that you have on how this event went. And another thought too is, for those of you who are interested, we will be posting this event hopefully within the next day or two. We are hosting a workshop around how to work with USAID, everything that goes into the process of working with USAID. So that is something that we are going to be hosting at the end of this month. So stay tuned for that. That'll be on our website very shortly. And that is everything I think I wanted to mention. I also want to say too that we will share any information about this event with all of you as we finalize everything. But the recording should be up, but we just need to confirm a few things on USAID's end to make sure that that is 100% certain. But hopefully all of that will be shared with you within the next week to 2 weeks. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it, your support and attendance, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day.